Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, hello. Hello, Véronique. Hello, Tim. Hello, Nathalie, and others who are arriving right now. I'd love while people are arriving, it's our Fab Decisions for Fab Cities conference today. It's going to be an interactive conference, and while people settle in, my name is Samantha Slade. I'm with Berrett-Koehler Co-op, and I'm really happy to be with you here today. And I would love it if any of you are arriving with questions on this decision-making session with Fab City. I would love for you to just pop them in the chat while I wait for the other people to arrive, and then we'll get started. And I'd love to hear if there's just any questions people are arriving with, because it allows me to make sure that we address those specific questions. So some of you turned up maybe just to discover, and other people turned up with a specific curiosity. And both are great and both are welcome. What we will be doing today is I'm going to be sharing why I think decision making is so important for Fab Cities and co-creating the new futures that we want. And then I'm going to be introducing us to a framework that can help help break through the decision paradigms which are inside a lot of us, and then share some tips and tricks for decision making. And I would like to have hopefully the participation of a couple of people, and maybe even somebody to come and spotlight and work with a decision case that you're working with. We will be focusing mainly on collective decision making, because that's where all the juiciness is around decision making. And so let's just give it a little extra moment. And then we're going to start. So for all of us, anybody who knows me, when I start a session, I give a little bit of the purpose today is to break through our decision-making culture that we have inside us to another one, just work with decision-making more consciously. Everything we're creating in the world in Fab Cities, decision-making is part of that. And the way I would like to start us off today is to have us all connect with a collective decision we've been part of recently. That was a positive experience, because I know there's a lot of challenging experiences out there. And it's really good to remember that amongst the challenging decisions that we're part of in the world, there's always some space and somewhere that there's been a positive experience going on. So if anybody would like to put in the chat, if you can take a moment and think of one, I'm going to share one for me. And while I'm sharing, I'd love for you to think of your own situation and a positive experience that you might have experienced. And I'm going to share one from this week. So this week, I was working with a large group of people. We were 45 people. And this group of people had a decision that I call it blocked. It was so important for them. It mattered so much, and it stirred up so much emotion, and they couldn't figure out how to really work it through. And so nobody was approaching the decision. It's become like this kind of thing where you just don't touch the decision and go near. And I turned up with this group and heard about a little bit of the, what would I call it? A little bit of the struggle of wanting to go into this decision-making space and not feeling they were able to. And I was like, great, we're going to go in together. I got a protocol, generative decision-making, in we go. And we just had a couple of rounds and we went on in, and this protocol just helps us stay, it just helps us be able to break through completely. And so that was my positive decision this week. It took maybe 45 minutes, and in 45 minutes with a protocol, it was like all the emotions, all of the everything was there. And we finally gave what I call motion and movement to something that was stuck amongst a group of people. And that felt absolutely fabulous. And before I jump in, I would just want to know if there's anybody else here today who would love to come and just pop in and share a positive decision-making experience? Kenny? Oh, Kenny's just arriving. Sorry, Kenny. Hello.
I can share a positive experience.
Oh, I love it, Tim. I'm so excited to hear.
I live in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And
yes.
That is a border city. And if you know True Grit, this is the city of True Grit. The Marshall's Museum is opening here. But about 2 years ago, the local medical school, a DO school, purchased a 318,000 square foot building. And they're converting it into the largest research DO facility in the nation. And they're also going to have a high school in there. It's a charter school. They're putting in arts, crafts, exercise, all kinds of things. And then a new cardiac sonography program from a local community college is going in there. But I started talking with them about, let's put the Fort Smith Fab Lab there, because it had been in, I don't know, 4 or 5 garages. And they said, absolutely. So the Fort Smith Fab Lab now is housed in a research medical building, and we're doing classes, and I see a lot of potential for interaction with the medical students and the community. It is an MIT Fab Lab. And so it went from disjointed to jointed. And I think that's a really positive thing for this area. And it's, of course, open to everybody, but it's really cool to see things, you know, that are just out there and suddenly, wow, here they are. So I think that's one of the coolest things I've seen the last couple of years, is going from, yes, a chartered MIT Fab Lab with many locations, you know, garages, bedrooms, whatever, to a true Fab Lab where people can actually come in and work.
Fabulous. I really love this example, because for me, when we've got a positive experience with decision making, it's like we're able to work through the blockages, the fears, the concerns, the worries, the different perspectives, and break through into movement where something gets to happen. And this is a really great example of that movement happening. And it's really helpful if, when we go and think about decision making, if we can be connected to those moments where decision making creates movement, because that's when all the possibility happens. And so we started out with that today. And the one thing I want to do is, as we jump in, I want to give a little bit of framing of why it's so important to me to be talking about decision making when we're talking about Fab Cities. So you see behind me here, I've got 2 pictures. I'll come back so you can see them better. It's basically the exact same elements that are organized in one side in a circle and then the other side into a triangle. And they basically represent 2 worldviews that coexist right now. So this circle worldview is all of the different elements that are organized, where each of them have value and they're in interconnection and interdependence together. In this worldview, we represent it as the circle, and it probably corresponds with a lot of values that some of us have around the Fab City movement of cooperation and connection and thinking collectively, and that's the circle one. Over here, this triangle or pyramid worldview is the exact same items that are organized in a hierarchical way. For those of you who know me, I wrote a book, Going Horizontal, and I'm very interested in thinking about these 2 worldviews that coexist together. So my background is cultural anthropology. I strongly believe that we're wired as human beings to be thinking from this place of collective, and there's value and respect, mutual respect and reciprocity among human beings. And most of us have spent our lives living in, working and learning in organizations that are set up based on this worldview, which is one that's created a lot of our conditioning. And that most of us today are living in our organizations in this space in between the 2 where they coexist, where we know that we want to be working with relationships and well-being and caring for each other, but we have this idea of, I would call it competition and individualism and coercive or trying to influence each other over here. And these two are kind of bumping up against each other and not always the most conscious ways. And part of living in our world today is living consciously with these two worldviews coexisting. So the Fab City movement is clearly a movement over here. And the decision-making habits that we have today, most of us are conditioned from over here in the pyramid. So it's quite an interesting space to be in a movement that has a real intention over here in co-creating a new future that creates, you know, potential and well-being for all. But because of this conditioning over here, it can actually create confusion, tension, frustration, complexity. So decision-making is one of the key pieces that I like to dive into, because decision-making is where power shows up. And so power is one of the key elements of doing healthy collaboration and getting things in movement. So if we can work with the power piece consciously and explicitly with good methodologies, we can actually train ourselves to step away from this worldview and paradigm that's made it inside us and step more intentionally into this way over here. Does that make sense to everybody when I say that? It's both simple and complex, these two images and the space in between that we live. Are there any questions before I jump forward on this? All right. So what I would like us to do would be, the best thing to do would be to have somebody who has a collective decision upcoming, and that we would use that as a case to work through a framework that I've developed, that us at Percolab together we've developed actually, and that we've been working with in many spaces, that helps us work more consciously in this, towards this space, and to be able to kind of see how the worldview has gotten into us, and to help us work in a place where we can be in those difficult spaces around collective decision-making, where things are getting stuck and where the movement is struggling to go. And when the movement struggles to go, sometimes we give up on the actual important, creative, constructive, beautiful initiatives that are going on in the world that we need to co-create a better future. So I would love to have a volunteer from somebody who would like, who's just going, yeah, I'm in a situation and I'm in a group and we're working on this thing and we've got a decision to make, but I'd love to take this as a case and to work it through. And then it'll help you probably to approach it in a better way. Well, better way. I'm going to say more consciously. So just going to hold space a little moment to see who would like to be stepping up, and so we can use your case to work through our framework. Anybody got a case? I have one here in case there's nobody wants to step up. I have my colleague Nina with me here, and she is ready to step in and offer her case that we have not talked about previously, and that we would use it to walk through the process. All righty, Nina, it looks like you're up. So if everybody can welcome Nina, she's going to come in, and she has a really interesting decision-making case that I think could be interesting for us all to explore this framework with. Welcome, Nina.
Thank you, Sam. Hi, everybody.
So can you share with us a forthcoming collective decision-making situation that you have, and just so give us the topic so we can understand it, a little bit of the context, and then we'll dive in.
Right. So the topic is a project that we're involved in with a couple of my colleagues. It's a participative budget project. So it's really innovative, really fun to work in, really. And so at each stage of the process, we're trying to design it in a way that supports citizens to make decisions truly make decisions for their city.
Nina, before we go any further, can you just explain to everybody today, when you say participatory budget decision, what do you mean by participatory budget?
So a participatory budget is when a government, so it can be in any different level of government, allocates a sum of money and gives a bit of their sovereignty and leaves it up to the citizens to make the decision about how the money will be spent.
Fabulous. So you're in an initiative right now around participatory budget, and you have a collective decision to make around this. Can you share with me what the collective decision is?
Yes, so we have to decide on, at the very end of the process, there's going to be a vote. The citizens are going to decide which projects are going to be implemented in their neighborhoods. And so our decision that we have to make is what is the vote structure going to be like.
So what is the voting structure you're going to be giving to the citizens so the citizens can make the collective decision themselves thereafter on which budgets will be selected and be attributed budget?
Yes.
Can you just share with me how much budget we're talking here?
So we're talking about $500,000, and we're talking about, we have about 50 projects so far at this stage. There's probably going to be about 40 that will be submitted to the vote.
So this is a really great case. It's a collective decision making. I hope everybody's got a little bit of the context now. So the first thing we did is we got clear on the subject. So that's number one. We know the subject. It's a participatory budget collective decision, right? And that's the thing that a lot of people do is they jump in to start making the decision. And I like to pull it back a little bit, because collective decisions, it really helps us to have discernment in collective decisions if we can identify the question underlying the decision. So Nina, I know you haven't prepped this, so we can just try this together. So if you had to name the question underlying this decision, what would it be?
For me, the question is really about how can we design a voting structure that is going to support citizens in making a decision, and one that they're not used to make as well. That element of usually citizens don't make the decision about the budget. So how can we support that through our design of the voting process?
So I'm going to speak it back to you, and you just let me know if this is it. How can we design a voting structure that can support citizens to make decisions that they don't usually make? How can we design a voting structure that can support citizens to make a decision they don't usually make? It's interesting because this question, it's opening it up to a lot of proposals, and you can feel the neutrality in it. Like, I'm not feeling you pushing me one way or another in this decision. And this itself is a skill. So way to go, Nina, on your question. Often when we ask the question underlying a decision, people can give a little bit of our own personal preference can show up in the question. So I was listening to Nina's question to see if it really was like neutral and open. So how can we design a voting structure that can support citizens make a decision they don't usually make? So from there, what we like to do is we give a clarity on what are the constraints and criteria that are associated with this question. And they could be lots and they could be few. And what we want to do is make sure that we're all in the understanding of what the constraints and criteria are. Again, I'm not jumping into proposals. We're just staying with the question a little bit. So are you up on your constraints and criteria?
So I guess the first constraints, I've been talking about a vote, like it has to be a vote. It's been announced as a vote. So there's many different ways of voting, but it has to be called a vote. The decision.
So that's not an option. It has to be named a vote. The process can be, but it's identified as a vote.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's the one. Apart from that, I can't think of any major constraints.
Any criteria around the decision? So anything that, yeah.
Yeah. So it needs to be so there's tens of thousands of people that need to be able to participate to this decision.
Tens and thousands of people need
It's
to.
a big borough. It's the biggest borough in Montreal.
Okay.
Yeah. 12 and up is the age of people
12 and
who
up.
are eligible to make that decision.
Okay.
And it has to be clear for us coming out of the vote, how many projects are going to go through. We have a 500,000 budget. The range of budgets in each project is going to vary from 10,000 to 200,000. So depending on what project comes on top, you can see how that can be tricky. So we also need a voting system that's efficient, that we can make, that it's going to be clear that the decision's made from that vote.
All right, so we got number like that. So first of all, we had our underlying question. Now we have both our constraints and our criteria have been clarified. Thanks, Nina. We're going to move on to the next one, right? And so the next one is about where is this decision going to be made and with whom? And I want to nuance in here because the with whom is who can partake in it, which is different than who is partaking in it.
Right. So it's tricky here because we're talking about a decision of a way that we're designing a decision that citizens are going to make.
Yeah.
So I just need a little precision on like, so this is like the people who are involved in the decision of designing that decision-making process.
So the people who were designing the decision-making process are designing the way the voting is going to be going.
Right.
Yep. And so, and when is that going to be made? Is that clear? Like, is there a moment? Is there an official like meeting or something that happens? Or is it like a work session that some people are organizing? Who's invited?
Who's invited? So we have a committee
from
people at the city. So it's about 10 people. We're going to meet at the beginning of September. And it's not necessarily with them that the decision is going to be made. They're gonna have a role of like we're gonna more consult them and then take the decision.
Who's we then?
So we is my colleague Simon. Who
Yes.
works with me on the project.
Yeah. Yourself.
Myself.
Your colleague and
I guess our vis-a-vis at the city we have.
So there's three people who are going to decide.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's essentially that.
And you're okay. So that leads in really great to the next one, right? But before I go for this, so what I'm hearing is, it's not everybody's invited to decide this. You've closed it to 3, and you're making sure you're getting some information on what's possible and what people want from the city perspective beforehand. Yes, and a little maybe nuance, an additional thing is we're going to make the decision, design it together. Ultimately, there's hierarchy and people working at the city will eventually decide whether what we designed, are they comfortable going forward with this? So I'm assuming they are, but there's always a chance that if it's too innovative, if it's too out of the box, and there's always that little element there. So they do have decision-making power, but in a different setting, it'll be after we make our decision on how we want to do this. So Nina, I love this because I'm getting to the part which is what is the decision-making method you're going to be using to make this decision? And I'm going to share my screen here with everybody out there, because I feel like this is going to help us to think about it. So if I just go to slideshow mode, so everybody can see, I've got, so we work with 5 different decision-making types. And I was listening into this is the next element. So what's the method you're going to be using? And before, I want you to think about it, because there was a lot I was hearing. And there's a lot of confusion in decision-making about the method. So let me just name these 5 types so everybody can understand them. So we're talking a shared language here. So autocratic is when somebody makes a decision on their own, super really clear and simple for most people. Democratic is when there's a voting system and it's usually the majority decides. We have advice process. I'm hearing a little bit of that in your process where you still get to hold the decision-making authority, but you can go and get advice from people impacted by it or people who have expertise to give to that decision-making. Consent-based decision and consensus are the two others, and there's a little bit of confusion between these two. Just to help clarify, consent-based decision-making, the way that we approach it is that if there's no objection, the decision is good enough for now and safe enough to try. So the focus is on movement, and consensus is when everybody agrees. So no objections versus we're all on board. So those are the 5 different decision-making types. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so we can come back to you, Nina. And so after seeing those 5 and thinking of your situation, are you able to name with clarity what's the decision-making methodology in this context of this question? How can we design a voting structure for citizens?
I'm able to narrow it to 3 of them. There's different components, and I'd love to hear you about that. Is the way that we're going to design it in our internal meeting at Berrett-Koehler, it's going to be very much consensus. When we co-design something, it's really about, not everybody's preference, but about
Consent.
yes,
Right.
it's like, yeah.
Okay. So who are you going to,
So that's our team. That's the 3 people.
The 3 people.
Yes, that's us. The way that we're going to design it.
You're working with consent. So good enough for now, safe enough to try, no objections.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And we're going to consult as well because we have that
So
committee.
you've got this advice process that's
Exactly.
feeding into your consent-based process.
There we go.
Right.
And there's always that autocratic element where
The hierarchical.
obviously, because yes.
So this is a
system
moment
we're
where I
working
come
with.
back to this and I say that we're navigating both of these in our world
Yes.
today. And navigating that consciously and skillfully with open heart, acceptance, and discernment is quite a talent. And it sounds like you've got a really good case that's got advice process to start with, then moving into consent-based decision-making, but all of that is feeding into an advice process for a hierarchical space that ultimately has the authority for the final decision. Yeah. I would love it if there's any comments or questions for Nina and I on this part, because it's a really interesting one, this decision-making process. And it really, it's a great case you brought in, Nina. It exemplifies a lot of the complexity. And I think that we don't always name things so clearly with those 5 different methods that are out there. If I can take us to the next one, because we're not going to be making it like actually taking the decision today. But if we project ourselves into September and this decision has been made, the next piece on making decisions in a healthy way in a group is how is its decision going to be shared and communicated, and how are people going to be able to understand that this decision was made?
So transparency is actually one of the principles that we named at the beginning of the project, was going further with transparency and making sure that it would be both like accessible in the sense that we're going to be reaching out to people with that information and also easy to understand. So yeah, the way we're going to do it, I guess, is publicly naming which projects won the vote, but also naming all the other projects that came through the process.
That's a different decision-making process. This decision-making process about your voting structure, when you're going to actually decide on the voting structure, how is that going to be? It's really great. Did you see how Nina has not even thought of this question before? Like she skipped over to the other piece.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting one because in the transparency, there's probably going to be some questions about why this voting structure versus another one, right?
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
and now that I think about it, people have had a lot of opinions about it in our workshops of citizens having suggestions about it. Yeah, I think for me, it's announcing the vote. It's going to be, straight after we make that decision.
The voting structure.
Yes.
Right.
So we're going to make it public that people, what are they invited to do and
right.
how.
Are you going to share how you got to that decision for the voting structure?
I hadn't thought about it, and I would like to. I would like to be transparent as well about the way we've been working hand in hand with the borough. I think it would be really interesting, and for people, the intention behind the participative budgeting is to involve people in the way that cities are run.
Right.
So if we want to go fully into that intention, I think for me would be really important. I hadn't thought about it before.
And I mean, I think it's a really interesting case that we have, because we're working on shared power and decision making and co-creating new worlds and Fab Cities. This is a really great case, but your actual specific point about deciding the decision making structure, it's almost like I got a meta case, is like, it shows that there's power within even choosing the decision making structure and methodologies, right? And at some point, somebody needs to be making those decisions, right? But how transparent we are about them, or how we tell the story of them, or how you even reference the sources that are inspiring you, or an intentional hypothesis you're working with, or an experimentation, there's going to be some logic that's going to be in there, and it's going to be beautiful to see how you're going to document that in a few months' time. And then we get to the final one, which is acknowledgement. So this final step in collective decision-making is a really interesting one. We don't always think about it. Already the sharing is pretty great, right? But acknowledgement is those people who were not part of the decision-making. How are we, or they, how are we acknowledging the people who made the decision? Because there's something about taking the time and care to make a decision collectively together. There is like engagement, there's care. I mean, we can feel it from you. You want to be making a good decision on this process. You're not going to be making a perfect decision, because, by the way, folks, the perfect decision does not exist. And yet Nina's group will probably be held accountable for, it could have been this structure, it could have been that one, and you could be questioned on it. My guess is when we give recognition, it helps people want to dive in and do more complex collective decision-making in the future, right? So the experience you're going to live in September, October, when this comes out, and the way you get recognized in it, will probably have an impact. And you, how old are you, Nina?
I'm 25.
She's 25, Nina, is probably going to have an impact on how Nina, who right now is a very engaged citizen and professional, is going to be wanting to get into this messy zones in the future. And you're well surrounded to support you, but it's really the recognition that's around makes a difference. And there's a question in there for us, is like, how am I recognizing the work, the care, the effort of those who are making a collective decision, especially when this is the especially bit, especially when the collective decision wasn't exactly my personal preference. Because if we're able to do that, then we're creating a healthy collective decision-making field in which people have the energy, the impetus, the feeling support to go back and to go and do more of these spaces. And I don't know about you, but the way I'm seeing things going on, we need to be doing so much innovation in our world. And so doing those kind of innovation activities that Fab City or this involves requires human beings, citizen members and others, who get involved and engage and feel a sense of positive appreciation, accomplishment, and recognition, and being seen for the hard work they've done. Acknowledging the decision won't be perfect. And so I don't want to ask the question about how other people are doing it. It's really a question for each of us, and to look at right now, like right now, how am I and how are you recognize and acknowledging decisions that other people are doing and investing in and taking care of, that you wouldn't necessarily have done that way. And this brings us to like one of our key capacities of our times. And this is being able to separate my personal preference from working in service of a common good. And we are right back here. personal preference, common good. So we got in between, I would call it the zone of tolerance, where I'm like, oh, it's not necessarily the way I would have preferred it to be or the way I'm comfortable with it being, but I can distance out my personal preference and work with my zone of tolerance. And for those of you who've been working in consent-based decision-making, normally this is a skill that you've mastered or are practicing and getting better at. It works with time. I can share with you the anecdote of when it came, and thanks, Nina, thanks so much for this. I can share with you the anecdote of when I really became self-aware of my own comfort of having decisions that were based on my personal preference. And it really is, it's a moment where we were organizing an event that we organized every year, and it would always get organized by me. And when I organized it the way I wanted to organize it. And I was so delighted that somebody else was organizing it. This is like about a year or two ago, a couple of years ago, that somebody else was stepping up and saying, I'm going to organize it this year, Samantha. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. And as she went off to organize it, she was like, but you do understand it'll be organized differently based on my vision, and you won't be able to have your personal preferences be met. And in that case, when I organize events, I'm very much a lover of water, and I always make sure that the event is connected to water. And I took it for granted that every time we would do this event, it would always have water involved. And she said to me, that's not my personal preference, so it's not a guarantee. And I remember going home that night and thinking, oh, should I get back involved in organizing the event? Should I try and convince her of the value of having water in an event? And I ended up with a third option, which is, Samantha, you've got to learn to let go of having the world organized based on your personal preferences. Yes. So there you go. Thank you, Veronique, for the complex example that Nina had. But she said it's a very clear analysis. And this method of going through this framework, I invite all of you into it. I'm just going to remind us of all the steps of it right now, so we can go back and just remember it. We started with what's the topic of the decision? What's the question underlying the decision? What are the constraints and criteria of the decision? Where will this decision be taking place, and with whom, and how are those people actually being able to decide that they'll be partaking in it or not? So there's a bit around that. What's the method that will be used for making the decision? How will it be shared out and people notified around it and around the decision? And then finally, how are people outside of the decision recognizing the decision? And that's the little analysis tool. I would love to come in and see, I wanted to share as well 3 really simple tips that can help us shift in our decision-making culture that for me are so small, but they make big difference, and they really help us play in this space more consciously. So the first one is shifting the basic question we have when we're with people. So you will often hear, and I often use it, and I'm sure you do too, because it's made its way around in the world. You got an idea and it's like a proposal, and I'm like, hey, Nina, and hey, whoever, right? I'm with a group of people and I speak my proposal, and I'm like, I have this idea, we could do daka daka dak. What do you think about it? Do you like it? Are you on board? How are you feeling about it? So that question I have is very normal, right? Because I'm trying to elicit a feeling of, is my proposal landing in people? But when I ask that question around who's on board with it, I'm giving priority to the voices that are in alignment. And I'm not actually focusing on those voices who have concerns, objections, or information that might be out of my range of sight. So I can shift the question upside down and say to people instead, I got this idea, da, 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 and we could do this, da, 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 da. And does anybody here would anybody here not be able to live with this proposal? Or would anybody here not be able to live with this idea? So it really shifts it. It feels a little weird in the mouth. It feels a little weird to say it because we're not used to doing that. But when we shift that way, what we're doing is it's almost like an act of inclusion, where you're going and saying those voices that are the voices of dissent, right? That we could actually are curious and want to hear them. And that's a flip over here, because here you're coming from a place of collective intelligence and curiosity to all the different possibilities, versus over here, I'm trying to influence you to my way of doing things. It's very, very interesting. Have a question from Tim in the chat. Is the proposal likened to moving from divergent to convergent thinking? It's really quite interesting because when we asked the question, Tim, in the center, we were very going into the divergent space, like what's possible, and it's what's great about it when the question is neutral, it's allowing all the possibilities of thought to be coming in. And at one point, the proposal, of course, is a moment of convergence where we go in and go from all those possibilities, the proposal is bringing us in, and the actual decision is the moment where we go, okay, this is final for now. I say final, comma, for now, because most decisions, not all, but many decisions can be adjusted and changed thereafter. And I think it's something we don't always think about is this a for now decision or not? And when we add the for now on it, it really comes and takes down a little bit of the pressure on it. So that actually is a little bit of the second tip. So the first one is about shifting to, is there something I can't live with? And the second one is this decision is for now, which is pretty great. And the third one has to do with one of the things that happens over and over. We're very, when we get into decision making, we can have a little bit of anxiety because that decision is going to be made, and we're there with our preferences, but we're also there with the potential and the possibility. So we can have a little bit of inner stress or anxiety that shows up. Perfectly normal. I got it all the time. I can jump to a reaction around a proposal. And if I jump to a reaction too fast, what I'm doing is I'm not actually clarifying that I understand the proposal well first. So one of the tips that I really invite us to practice, and it really comes from functioning more over here, is to separate clarifying questions and the clarifying phase, and to really give space and time for clarifications before going into reaction. So working more consciously and directly with clarifying a proposal or an idea before jumping into reactions. And I say that, it sounds really, really easy, but it can have a certain challenge to it. The thing about all of this is when I talk about the socio-ecological transition and all of the crisis that we're in the world right now, there's this one way of talking about it. It comes from Joanna Macy and David Corton. They talk about what they call the Great Turning. And they talk about the three things that the Great Turning is things that we need to be doing less of, things we need to be co-creating to do completely differently than we were doing in the past, Fab City. And the third piece, which gets a little bit neglected, I do think, and it's the internal shift inside ourselves. And the internal shift inside ourselves is really about moving from here and starting to see how I'm really working from some legacy remnants that come from us, from a world that was not designed for the well-being of all and has individualism and extraction and whatnot at its center. And this is what has created the crises that are there. And it's the internal shift that's going to get us over there. Working with power more consciously is part of that process. We have a few minutes left. And I'm kind of curious, because there's a few things I could share right now. But if any of you are familiar with consent-based decision-making, and maybe we should model a little consent-based decision-making process. The one that I use that I really appreciate is called generative decision-making. It's out there. If you look up generative decision-making, Berrett-Koehler or Samantha Slade, you'll find it in an instant. It's out there on the web. We even have little like folders you can download, you can print, you can reference. There's all sorts of things. But it's basically a 7-step protocoled process for consent-based decision-making. And what it does is it allows a group or a community to be able to make collective decisions together with a shared language, a shared vocabulary, and a shared process. And once you have that, this is what it does, is it creates a decision-making culture. And that could make all the difference, because once you have a decision-making culture, then people know when you say we're going to make a decision about something or other, it's all going to be understood, the approach to it. And so people can be better to say, oh, I don't need to be involved. So-and-so could be involved. You can have way more trust and inner ease and calm when your decision-making culture is defined and explicit. So one of the things that I have found that's really interesting to have in a decision-making culture is a consent-based decision-making process. So if you're not familiar with one and you haven't experienced it, I would love to walk us through this process. And to do that, I just need a little decision. Nina, would you come back and we could try something out? And we'll just do something small so you can understand the process. So again, Nina and I have not rehearsed, and so we just want to share this with you. So it's a 7-step process. And the first step of the process is, we call it ripeness. And it's just, you just take a moment to sit. You're not jumping into a proposal, but you need a topic and maybe a question. So is there something that we could make a real decision between the two of us right now? Just anything.
It just involves the two of us.
Yeah, collective decision, us right now, unless somebody from the audience would love to join us as spotlight, and we'll do it, the 3 or 4 of us. We'll make a decision right away. And if people come, I actually have an idea. So if we make a decision between the 2 of us, it'll be very simple about something with us for this evening, because I think that's very easy. And if people come from the audience, I'd love to make a decision about how to gift a book or a game to somebody from this group today.
I like that.
That would be very easy. And again, it's a little bit like your voting process. What's the methodology we use to gift something to a group of people in a way that feels fair?
I really like that.
Fair and equitable and good. So if I have any hands raised, if you can take your microphone off and just speak up, and then we'll spotlight you and come in the center, and we'll have a little moment to experience the generative decision-making process. Not everybody is good, is comfortable, but we're going to see. If not, Nina and I'll do a very simple, small one. All right, Nina, it looks like our listeners are a little shy, so let's give it a go. So a decision to make?
But I'm thinking about making a decision around what we're going to do afterwards.
You want to do a decision on that?
Yeah.
So our question is, what are we going to do after this session?
Yeah.
All right.
And I would even put a theme on it. Is it
You want it?
I want to include the element of celebration.
Oh, how are we going to celebrate today? Just for everybody context, Nina and I have been working together today since 7 a.m. We've been driving, doing presentations. It's been an intense day. And so Nina wants to have question, how are we going to celebrate together today? There we go. So that is step 1. And I'm going to put them in the chat as we go through to the steps of this. So number 1 is ripeness. And I think this one is so simple that just naming the question is enough that one of us will make a proposal, right? So 2 is a proposal. and it's a version 1 of the proposal. So either Nina and I can do the version of the proposal, right? But we know it's a first version of a proposal. So should we, who's got a proposal?
Mine's fairly vague, so you might specify it, but my proposal would be that we go to a nice restaurant.
So Nina's proposal is we go to a nice restaurant. She's self-aware it's vague because step number 3 is clarification questions. So when you say nice, what does that mean?
I think what I mean by that is a restaurant that will both, nice for me is that I like the food and that we both like the food.
Okay. Can anybody else be involved?
Yes.
Is there a geographical boundary?
Not really, no, I'm open.
Okay. So that's clarification rounds done right there. And you can see how Nina's used to doing clarification rounds. And number 4 is reactions. What's interesting is the proposer does not give a reaction, only the other people. And in this case, it's just me. So my reaction is, Nina, that's so vague. I would love for you to be in your personal leadership and just name something more specific. And you know what I like, you know where we could go, or just like, yeah, take charge. I would love that for you to be able to name something. And yeah, that's it. That's my reaction. So step 5 is proposal, version 2. And so the proposer is invited to do a new version of proposal.
So I have a restaurant in mind. So I'm going to make a second version. I just can't remember the name of the restaurant. It's a Spanish restaurant that's close to here that we like to go. But yes, my proposal is that we go to that restaurant specifically.
Go to the Spanish restaurant close to here. So that's step number 5. We move on to step number 6, which is objections. Step number 6, the idea is I can only object based on this proposal as currently formulated causes harm or backward movement to us based on known information. And so it's not about my personal preference anymore, right? So objections cannot be about personal preferences. All my personal preference thoughts and ideas and feelings went into the 4th reaction round. So I got no objections. So what's interesting, as soon as there's no objections, it's like we've just made a collective decision, but there is a 7th round, which is what we call visual confirmation. And the visual confirmation round is just a little like safety valve in this process in which we get to see that everything that needed to be spoken was spoken and we don't need to go back to the objections round. So it's just like, yeah, I was here, we can live with it. That's really great. And what I want to say to people is this here, if you're in a group and somebody had an objection, but they didn't speak it up for whatever reason, we know that mostly they would be unable to stick up their thumb. They would be like, And so instead of seeing that as a problem, you can say, oh, our visual confirmation did good work today and helped us see that there's an objection that still needs to be spoken. And we go in and we listen to it, not because we think that it's a pain, because we want to hear what objections are. And that's what the shift is to this, is we're curious about the objections. And we would have a conversation with whatever is spoken about the objection to see if it's coming from personal preference, fear, concerns, projections, which are all valid and get to exist and be heard and acknowledged, but are not taken on board as an objection. And that is a practice of kindness in and of itself. So thank you, Nina, again. And that brings us to the end of our session today. And I would just love people to put in chat a little something that that delighted you in the session today, What's a little something that delighted you or a little learning that you're leaving with? Just would love to hear a little bit of that. And if somebody would like to open their microphone, we would love to hear a real voice to come into the room and let us know how the session was for you today. Yes, Veronique, love to hear from you.
Hi, so sorry. I was not daring interact because it was just like an eye opener. And thank you so much. I went once to La Chicanerie and it was already like a major thing. And yeah, it seems, as you say, like simple, but not at all, because there's so many things that we act just automatically or whatever, that it's practice, practice, practice. So thank you. And for you, like being so such a good communicator. It's great to see that.
Thank you, Veronique.
It's
It
inspiring.
was a real pleasure. I really feel like this decision-making piece is so accessible for people to learn. It's not that far away from us to be able to learning and practicing and really break through to a much more caring and inclusive way of functioning around power in this space, in service of collective good, which is so what we need to be doing. So thank you for sharing that, Veronique.
And what I liked, it was the decision making, bringing movement, and it's absolutely that. Just not to be stuck, and that's what really sparkled today.
Oh, I love it that sparkled. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone that was with us today. It's been a lovely session together. And I'm wishing you well as you go forward, practicing the little tips that we talked about, generative decision-making, or using the 7 principle framework around collective decision-making. And I hope that you will be co-creating new futures and creating movement wherever you go. Thank you, everyone.